My brother-in-law pulled into my mother's driveway in a leased BMW he could not comfortably afford, and he looked at my 8-year-old Honda parked at the curb, and he laughed and he said, "Still driving that thing?" Rachel and I said yes. And he said, "When are you going to upgrade?" And I said, "I'm comfortable." And he said, "You know what they say about people who drive old cars?" And I said, "What do they say, Derek?" And he said, "It's not a compliment." And he laughed again and went inside. And my sister followed him, and my mother gave me a look that meant she had heard it. And I gave her a look that meant it was fine. And I went inside and I helped with lunch and I ate and I smiled and I answered questions about work with the answers I always give, which are vague and pleasant. And I left at 3 and I drove my 8-year-old Honda to the dealership I own, and I sat in my office and I looked out at 46 cars on the lot, and I thought about Derek's leased BMW and I thought the payment on that lease is probably close to what I clear per vehicle, and I have 46 vehicles on this lot right now. And I did the math in my head, and I drove home, and I slept very well. Okay, hello everyone. Welcome back. New faces, returning faces. Genuinely so glad you're all here today, because this one is equal parts satisfying and a little bit funny. And I have been wanting to tell it for about 2 years. My name is Rachel. Drummond and I am 35 years old, and I own an automotive dealership that my grandfather started in the 1970s and that my father ran until he retired 6 years ago, and that I have been running since I was 29, and it is a real business, with real employees and real inventory and a real revenue number that I do not discuss at family lunches. And the car I drive is an 8-year-old Honda Civic that I chose deliberately because I work at a dealership and I could drive anything on that lot home tonight if I wanted to. And I choose not to, because I learned from my grandfather that the way you treat money when nobody is watching is the actual measure of your relationship with it. And my grandfather drove a 12-year-old truck until the day he handed the business to my father. And my father drove sensible cars his entire career. And I drive a sensible car, and Derek drives a leased BMW. And I think about that sometimes when I am paying myself a salary out of a business that has been profitable for 50 years. Derek married my sister Amanda 4 years ago, and Derek is not a bad person. I want to say that clearly, because the story is more honest with that in it. And what Derek is a man who has built his entire sense of self around visible markers of success, and visible markers of success require an audience, and our family gatherings are his preferred audience. And at every gathering, Derek finds a way to position himself relative to everyone else in the room, and the positioning requires someone to be lower. And I had been that someone for 4 years because I drove an old car and gave vague answers about work and did not wear expensive things. And Derek had decided I was the least impressive person at the table, and he had been making that decision comfortable for 4 years, and I had let him. Because correcting Derek required explaining myself, and explaining myself to Derek felt like a transaction I did not want to make. And so I had smiled and passed the bread and driven home in my Honda and lived my life. And the only person in my family who knew the full picture was my mother, because my mother had been to the dealership, and my mother understood, and my mother kept my business the way I kept it, which is quietly and without performance. The thing about Derek's comments was not that they hurt me, and I want to be honest about that, because they did not hurt me in any way that required repair. They were just consistently there the way background noise is there, and you only notice it when it stops. And Derek's comments about my car had been running since the second family gathering he attended after marrying Amanda, and they had included classics such as Rachel. You should let me take you to look at something newer, and Rachel. A woman your age should be driving something that reflects her success, and my personal favorite, which was said at a Christmas dinner 2 years ago, which was, "I just think you deserve better than that car," Rachel said with the specific generosity of a man who believes he is conferring a favor by noticing you at all. And I had said, "Thank you, Derek, that's kind." And I had meant 0% of it, and Amanda had changed the subject, and my mother had refilled the water glasses, and life had continued. What changed was not a plan I made. It was a Tuesday in March when Derek called me, and he called me directly, which he had never done before, and he said, "Rachel, I need a favor." And I said, "What kind of favor, Derek?" And he said, "I'm looking to buy a car." And I said, "Okay." And he said, "A good one, not a lease this time." And I said, "What are you looking for?" And he described what he wanted, and I said, "I think I can help you." And he said, "Do you know someone at a dealership?" And I said, "I know someone, yes." And he said, "Can you get me a deal?" And I said, "I can probably arrange something." And he said, "I would really appreciate that." Rachel and I said, "Of course, Derek." And I said, "Why don't you come Saturday and I'll introduce you?" And he said, "Perfect." And I gave him the address, and on Saturday, Derek pulled into the Drummond Automotive lot in his leased BMW, and he parked and he got out, and he looked at the signage, and he looked at me standing at the entrance, and he said, "Drummond," and I said, "Yes," and he said, "Is that your name?" And I said, "It is." And he said, "This is your family's dealership," and I said, "It's my dealership." "Yes," and he said, "You own this," and I said, "Since I was 29. "Yes," and he said, "How many cars?" And I said, 46 on the lot. "Today." And he said, "Rachel," and I said, "Come inside, Derek," and he came inside, and I walked him through the lot, and I introduced him to my sales manager and my finance manager, and I showed him what we had that matched what he wanted, and he was very quiet for most of it, and at one point he said, "You could have told me," and I said, "Told you what?" "Derek," and he said that you owned this, and I said, "You never asked," and he said, "I made comments about your car," and I said, "You did," and he said, "I feel like an idiot." And I said, "You didn't know, Derek," and I said it genuinely because he didn't know. And not knowing is not the same as being an idiot. It is just not knowing. And the idiot part was assuming. And that was a different conversation for a different day. And I got Derek a good deal on a solid car, because that is my job. And he drove it home, and he called Amanda from the lot. And I heard him say, "You knew." And Amanda said, "Of course I knew, Derek," and he said, "Why didn't you tell me?" And she said, "Because it wasn't my story to tell, and I thought about my sister in that moment, and I thought she is better than I give her credit for, and I made a note to tell her that." At the next family lunch, Derek arrived in his new car, and he helped carry things in from the kitchen. And at the table, he said, "I went to Rachel's dealership last month," and my mother looked at her plate and smiled, and Derek said, "I had no idea," and my aunt said, "What dealership?" And he said, "Drummond Automotive," and my aunt said, "Oh, that's been there forever," and Derek said, "Rachel runs it," and my aunt looked at me and said, "Since when?" And I said, "Since I was 29, and my aunt said, "All this time," and I said, "All this time," and she said, "And you drive that Honda," and I said, "I like that car," and my grandfather drove a 12-year-old truck, and she laughed, and Derek said, "I made a lot of comments about that Honda," and I said, "You did, Derek." And he said, "I'm sorry, Rachel," and I said, "I know," and he said, "I mean it," and I said, "I know you do." And I passed him the bread basket, and he took a piece, and the table moved on. And Derek has not said anything about my car since that lunch, and at the last gathering, he arrived in his new car, and I arrived in my Honda, and he looked at it, and he looked at me, and he smiled, and I smiled back, and we went inside, and nobody said anything about either car, and that was the most comfortable family lunch we have had in 4 years. And I think that is because Derek finally understood something that my grandfather tried to teach everyone, which is that the car in the driveway tells you almost nothing about the person holding the keys, and the person holding the keys to my Honda also holds the keys to a 50-year-old business and 46 cars on a lot, and Derek knows that now, and it changed the temperature of the room, and I think my grandfather would have found that extremely satisfying. And honestly, so do I.